Hi, my name is Sam Martin and this is Real Retrospective. This is a review show where we take a look at older films and see how they hold up over the test of time. Today we're going to be analyzing Danny Boyle's masterpiece, 28 Days Later, which is a post-apocalyptic zombie film starring Cillian Murphy and Naomi Harris. And to discuss the film with me, this is my guest, Brandon Hoots.
Hello.
So Brandon, what do you think about 28 Days Later?
Personally, I love 28 Days Later. It was really the first time I saw it was a great experience, and then I only saw it recently, maybe like a year ago, and I immediately recommended it to anybody who hasn't seen it since.
Yeah, well, I first watched this movie on G4 TV.
Are you serious?
Yeah, do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember G4.
So yeah, it was around Halloween 2010. I had just moved into my new house, and then my dad was like, Sam, do you want to come watch this movie with me? I was like, sure, Dad, what is it? And he was like, oh, it's a zombie movie called 28 Days Later. And I had previously seen the Romero films and fallen in love with them, and then I even watched Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, which is an experience as well. And then so the step after that was watching 28 Days Later. And the first time I watched it, the movie always stuck with me. I liked the low res, resolution of the camera. I liked that it was shot on videotape. I thought that that was very unique, and it made the film stand out to me. It's kind of ugly to look at, but the film itself is very well shot. One of my personal favorite scenes is the abandoned London scene, as you know. What's your take on that?
Well, I thought it was a brilliant scene. I like the trivia about it, that they actually had to tell everyone, yeah, we're gonna buy out the city for an hour. Everybody please either stay inside or get off the road. And that's a big undertaking.
Oh yeah, I thought it was pretty crazy as well. The rest of the movie was they blew all their budget on that scene specifically, so they had to shoot the rest of the film without permits. So that's another thing that I love about the movie, is that it was very guerrilla style, and it felt very Danny Boyle to me. Some of his more recent films are a little too crisp and clean for my liking. Mainly 127 Hours was that was very retro Danny Boyle to me, but the Steve Jobs movies that he did, I didn't like that very much. I thought that it was a little too pretty. Trainspotting 2, which I enjoyed, I still thought that it was a little too clean and crisp. The original Trainspotting is a fantastic film, and that and 28 Days Later are my two favorite Boyle films. And you've seen, other than 28 Days Later, you've seen Sunshine from Danny Boyle, is that right? Mm-hmm. Have you seen any of his other films?
Actually, I don't think so.
Yeah, we should check that out sometime. But yeah, 20 Days Later is an absolute masterpiece. I think we should show a scene from the London, abandoned London, to show the audience what we're talking about. So I think that scene is probably one of the best scenes in the movie, if not the best, because just the way that it starts with him just being a few pixels on the screen, and then it's just you realize what's wrong, what's happening, and then you see the billboards of all the missing people, and I just think it's absolutely stunning. And then John Murphy's soundtrack, who's the composer of the film, by the way, I think he does an amazing job throughout the film. I mean, obviously his best track is in the House in the Heartbeat at the end of the film. But that part of the film at the beginning where he's just walking, where it's just Jim walking around London, I just think it's masterful. The cinematography, the editing, the direction, everything just is on point there. And it's one of my favorite moments in cinema, to be honest. What do you think about the scene?
I always have thought of it from, I think, the perspective of the story of the film. And I think it's a really great opener. Within the first 5 minutes, because the first time we see him, he's getting out of a coma or something of that nature in a hospital, and he's starting to notice everyone's gone. He doesn't know what's going on, and then he's just overwhelmed with all of this, all of these postcards and missing person posters, and he's like, what in the world is going on? And it's just like all in his face, and I think it's really
Yeah, another thing that
cool
I really like about that, and it's throughout the whole film, is that the whole film has a very haze-like, dream-like feel to it. Is the way that the camera picks up like these really gross yellows and blues throughout, just really hits home to how it just makes you feel like you're stuck in this sort of purgatory. And of course, the film is very Catholic as well with its overtones. That obviously being the church scene, which is another fantastic scene in the film, where the cross is just dominating over Jim. And then we see him trying to find a father figure, literally in a priest. And that's another recurring motif throughout the film, is trying to find like a father and then becoming your own person as well. Because the thing about zombies films in particular, especially in the Romero films, is that like in Dawn of the Dead, the whole point is that zombies are sort of like people when they get obsessed with consumerism, is that you lose your individuality. And that's what I really like about the film. And 28 Days Later also harkens back to that idea of being your own person and trying to like not conform to the masses. Alex Garland, who wrote the film, does an amazing job of reinforcing these themes and motifs throughout the entire script. And another thing that I love about that scene, the London scene, is the action scene after, where we go into the church and then you see him go up to the rafters of the church and he looks down into the benches and he sees all the zombies in there, and then the zombie priest comes.
It's like hordes of zombies.
Yeah, there's hordes of zombies and they chase him out, and then we actually have a clip of it, of that scene after, and that's another scene that we're going to show next. Now that clip is another one of my personal favorites from that film. To help discuss it, I've brought another guest, Adam, who's my brother, and he watched the film for the first time last night actually, because here on Real Retrospective we like to show how the films hold up. So I've seen it before, Brandon's seen it, but my brother hasn't. So I figured that it'd be kind of cool to see how a newcomer would view this movie in 2017. So Adam, what did you think about this clip and the movie?
Well, I have to admit that I'm not much of a horror fan, but watching this movie, I was quite impressed. Throughout the whole thing, I was on my toes as I was trying to wrap my head around this whole apocalypse situation. And in regards to that particular scene in the church and the abandoned London scene, I think it did a lot to establish the tone of the movie, to make it seem like a surreal experience. And the church scene was an excellent way to sort of foreshadow the badness to come as the zombies.
Yeah, and like I said earlier, that the film has a lot of Catholic overtones, and obviously the cross is the big one. But another underrated one is at the end of the film when they're at the military complex, when the statue in the background. I did some research into that, and that's the statue of Laocoon and his sons, and it's a Catholic image that depicts human misery and suffering. So obviously that wraps in the whole idea of people suffering throughout, and that also furthers the idea of our characters in the film being stuck in a sort of purgatory, that they're still like not exactly in hell, but they're not in heaven either. And I think that that statue and the cross also depicts that very well. And another thing that's very interesting about this film is that I think it depicts a very unique shift in horror film content from the 20th century into the 21st century. Because in the 20th century, there were films like The Exorcist, Rosemary's Baby, all The Omen was another one, and all these films were dealt with like damnation and fear of the devil. But 28 Days Later isn't really about that. It's about like biological warfare and terrorism and our sort of social malaise that we're in at the moment, how we always kind of fear something that we can't really see. And zombies also further that as well, not only the loss of individuality that they symbolize, but also they're sort of terrorists that I think is very interesting to look at as well.
I would almost say the film kind of reflects the fear of humans in general too.
Yeah.
Especially when they arrive at the military complex, kind of that entire second act is kind of focused on that theme, I believe.
And another thing that's very interesting about the film is that it started filming on September 1st, 2001. And while they did include a lot of 9/11 imagery at the beginning of the film, where the monkey's on that Clockwork Orange type contraption, and that's sort of implied that that's how the rage virus was created.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting how, like, even right before 9/11, like, you'd still feel that sort of paranoia and that fear of terrorism and fear of humanity and not being able to trust people, and how it's deep rooted into our society. Of course, the film's not about don't trust people. The film is about finding connections and finding something worth living for. Like, Jim starts off very lonely and insecure, but as the film progresses, he meets Frank, who's great, and Hannah and Selena, and how all their relationships grow. And then there's the horses as well. When they go to the farm and they see all the horses there, I think that is very interesting to see how the horses are unaffected by everything and they just live on like nothing happened. I think that's another great scene. What's your take on that, Adam?
You know, it's sort of interesting going back to your idea of the transition from the 20th to 21st century. The 20th century was a massive century for change, you know, politically, economically, socially. And part of that was definitely sort of the decline in trust for a lot of government institutions, you know, with political events, particularly in the United States, even though the movie was made in London. But you can definitely see sort of that connection to, even though a lot of people's confidence in political institutions sort of declined with a bunch of travesties and scandals that happened in the 20th century, I think now that's the early 21st century, there's sort of this new vibe that the 21st century is not going to be like that. How even though we have sort of lost our trust in a lot of these institutions, we can still find something within all this madness, you know, some sort of humanity left over.
Yeah, and another thing, Brandon, I think you might know this. I think I told you this at one point, but obviously the film reflects the fear of biological warfare, but the sort of thing that sort of inspired Alex Garland to write that was mad cow disease, which was in the late 20th century, of course, and that sort of furthered our fear of not being able to trust the government, because obviously in the mad cow disease case, the government just sort of downplayed the infection. They're like, oh no, it's not that bad, but it turned out to be a pretty big infection in the 20th century. And 20 Days Later very much is a allegory for sort of how the government is not always in command. And I think that works as well. And Adam, of course, who studies politics, can further that as well, that people really don't trust the government anymore. And everyone's like, I don't really like it that much. And I feel like zombie films have always been a good allegory for that. Let's take a look at the first Romero film, 1968's Night of the Living Dead. 1968 was the most violent year in American history, modern American history at least. And that film sort of, while it wasn't created because of that, the film echoes that sort of time period of rebellion and counterculture and all that deep-seated hate that was still in our society. That film sort of unravels that all. But of course, that film's not really about that either. It's more about people ignoring the problem. And like, even though there's like extraordinary things happening to these people, they still focus on their own agendas. And 28 Days Later sort of has that as well with the military. Like Major West, who's played by Christopher Eccleston, he's sort of unfazed by everything that's going on. The main part of the film when he talks about people killing people, that speech, that really furthers the idea of how, like, from the eyes of a soldier, this is just normal. This is normality, people just killing people. And I think that's a very brilliant scene as well. What are your guys' takes on that?
Well, I had another scene in mind, mostly this time, which is possibly my favorite scene in the whole film, is the one in the supermarket. Because, you know, we've been talking, it's a dark film.
Very dark film.
But the scene in the supermarket really, like, I think captures the kind of, like, this, like, more like bright tone that you can see with the connections between the characters.
Yeah, they're a family at that point.
Yeah, and they've hardly even known each other that long, but like just they're feeling like actual like joy in that scene.
Yeah,
and I think it's a really interesting like foil kind of to almost all of your scenes in the film.
Yeah, and it's sort of another thing that I find very interesting is that whenever there's a sense like this film in particular seems to show chaos very well. When I think of chaos, I think of Jeff Goldblum in Jurassic Park, Chaos Theory.
Chaos Theory.
Chaos Theory. But but I think 28 Days Later kind of captured that idea of chaos theory very well. And I think that whenever there's something normal, something bad's about to happen right around the corner. You know, the scene with Frank when he kicks the fence or whatever it was, and the zombie blood falls on his eye, and that scene's like heartbreaking. That is a really, really powerful scene. It's probably the most powerful scene in the movie, I'd say. The most time you're like, No, because Frank's the most beloved character in the movie. Brendan Gleeson does a fantastic job in that film.
Yeah.
I mean, him, Christopher Eccleston, and Naomi Harris are the three best actors in that film. Cillian Murphy does a fine job, but I think that he's sort of overshadowed by those other three.
His voice is kind of...
Yeah, his voice is kind of dumb. We don't have any cheeseburgers.
It's so low. It's like,
So Adam, what's your personal favorite scene in the film?
Well, I guess one scene I really like is the scene where Jim has a nightmare. So he's sort of out in the open. He sort of wakes up after and finds that nobody's there. So he wakes up and sort of walks around, and he sees way off in the distance in this wide shot a bunch of sheep sort of herding together. And for me, at least, I think that really reinforced how this movie feels like a dream, because that sort of imagery is sort of what I would see in a dream. It's sort of surreal, like not like what I would expect when I would see a bunch of sheep just sort of herding together, like hundreds of sheep just sort of flying together. So
Yeah, I mean, Danny
take.
Boyle does a great job of capturing surrealism very well. Trainspotting is the prime example of that, the toilet scene. But 20 Days Later, the part where they're driving and it sort of looks like they're driving over like painted flowers. And then there's the scene, like again, I said earlier that the London scene has like this sort of that haze filter on.
Yeah.
Then the camera is always just like very voyeuristic and makes it feel like you're watching yourself in a dream, sort of, which I think is very interesting. And you don't really see that in a lot of big movies. Like you would see that in like a David Lynch film, but not exactly like a big dumb zombie movie like most people thought it would be. And that's another thing. Whenever I explain 20 Days Later to people, they always say that it's a very heady movie. And they're like, yeah, it's a little too heady for my liking. And that sort of confuses me because it's like, well, why? Do you want like another Friday the 13th type dumb action movie? I mean, dumb horror movie? But I think that 20 Days Later is probably one of those more intelligent horror films.
Definitely, indeed.
I mean, of course, well, Alex Garland's a very smart guy, Ex Machina.
Oh yeah, that's a fantastic movie.
And he also wrote The Beach, which is another Danny Boyle movie that has Leonardo DiCaprio in it. And it's just very interesting to see how 20 Days Later has held up over the years. I still think that it's very much speaks to today's society as it did back then. 15 years later, and the movie still works as a political allegory for violence throughout our world, and it's just a fantastic film. My personal favorite scene, actually, I say I have a bunch of possible favorite scenes, but I think I can say now that my favorite scene in the film is actually when they're in the tunnel.
The tunnel scene, really?
Yeah. I actually love the tunnel scene. Well, not like when they're just escaping the zombies, but it's more like that part where they drive over the wreckage. They're just going up, and then they go down, and the car breaks. It's just, that's the first time they sort of like bonded. I really felt like that was one of the first times that they sort of became a family. That was what caused the supermarket scene later on.
Yeah, or what caused the kind of like devastation of the
Yeah, because
Brendan Gleeson's death.
Yeah, and the thing that really sort of upsets me about a lot of horror movies is that there's not enough character building in them. And 20 Days Later has very, very good character building. You understand Jim very well from his first scene to his last. Naomi Harris, her character arc's a little blunt. Or she starts off like, oh, surviving's as good as it gets, but then at the end, it's changed.
Well,
I mean, it's good, but it's like you've seen that type before.
The zombies in the movie are just more of the setting. They're not really, they're not central to the plot. They're there as almost like an antagonizing element, but
yeah, I mean, the thing is that it's the zombies are sort of the icing on the cake. So, Adam.
Yeah.
Who was, as a first-time person, what did you expect this movie to be?
Well, I expect this film to definitely have a lot more zombie attacks in it, for the zombies to play a bigger role in it than it did. But I was surprised by how much character building there was in there, and how much it went out of its way to sort of not only build these characters, but serve as sort of an allegory for our society. Like you said, anything could have wiped out a lot of these humans. It could have been disease, war, whatnot. And they just threw in zombies too, just to create an extra element, side element. So, for me at least, that's a positive.
And finally, one other thing that I wanted to talk about was how do you feel about the running zombies? Because a lot of people don't seem to like running zombies. I think because the thing is that when their zombies are that super powered, they sort of cease to be. It's sort of unrealistic for the characters to survive as much as they do, and so this is another thing to see how it holds up, because running zombies are also very prevalent in our zombies genre as well. Like they run in Zombieland, they run in Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead, and they always get that speed boost. But 28 Days Later was one of those first films to sort of have the zombies be like a real threat. Because in Romero movies, they only really get you
They
in
just
a bunch
shuffle
of
around.
Yeah, they just kind of shuffle around, like in Dawn of the
like
Dead.
Shaun of the Dead too.
Yeah, and like Shaun of the they just sort of like scuffle around, and like they can only get you in numbers. And because the zombies were more symbolic then, but in 28 Days Later, they've worked both well as like being symbolic and being an actual threat, which is why I think the movie does it better than, say, Zombieland or Zack Snyder's Dawn of the Dead.
So I really like the running zombies kind of thing. Obviously, it goes a lot back to the whole, the nature of the disease is supposed to be like almost this kind of like form of rabies.
Yeah, and
or something. It stems from this rage virus, and it's not so much that they're zombies, is that they're these enraged, infected things. And I just I think that's a really cool thing, and I think that's influenced a lot of zombie-themed things today.
yeah. 20 Days Later is very much in pop culture. It's in the Dying Light video game.
Yeah, Dying Light feels like sometimes to me like a playable 28 Days Later. Even the story is like very similar.
Yeah.
Again, the zombies serve as more of something in the background. They're not necessarily part of the story. They're there as a hindrance.
Yeah. But another thing that I think that Adam would find this interesting as well is that Danny Boyle sort of said when he was making the film that he envisioned the rage virus as being a sort of social rage. And of course, again, that's the whole point of the movie, is that when you see all that violence in the Middle East stuff, they're all violent and stuff like that. And then the zombies, they're also kind of mirror that as well.
Yeah.
And I think that it's another way that it's like, yes, they're both a threat and they mean something, which is, you don't see that in horror movies really. The biggest problem with horror movies is that, well, at least in mainstream ones and big budget ones, is that they don't have a voice of their own. They just kind of just want to see people die. I mean, and that's fine if you just want to see someone get like their head cut off by Jason Voorhees or Freddy Krueger just slash someone in the abdomen. But I mean, when I watch horror movies, I like seeing like actual characters that I care about, because the whole point of a horror is that it can happen to you, or you can at least understand the horror. Or like not understand it as well. That's what also makes it scary. You either have to understand it and be afraid of why it's the way it is, or not understand it at all and try and be afraid of the unknown. And 28 Days Later, like the soldiers, they're like these horrible, evil rapists, and it's just like, oh god. But again, it's just another part of the movie.
And then it's like, well, I mean, like they're, you know, you have the enraged zombies, but you have these like corrupted humans. It's like there's not really any safe place to go.
Exactly, and again,
except for the bond that you know they found with like Naomi Harris, Cillian Murphy, and Brie Leeson's daughter's character. I forget the actress. But.
She's that's the one problem I do have with the film. That was her performance. Like, I know she was 14, like when the movie was being filmed, but kid acting.
If you look at like good. Leon the Professional, the Natalie Portman was a kid, she was excellent.
Or like DiCaprio in What's Eating Gilbert Grape. Yeah. But still, it's just like, she's just so awful. You know, when Brendan Gleeson gets shot, she's just like, Dad?
Yeah.
And then even in that tunnel scene, you just hear her like I think they like added her voice in post or something, because it didn't sound like she was saying it. She sounded like ADR.
She was probably one of the weaker points, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, she's like, I don't care, but at that point in the movie, she's like drugged out of her mind. But still, it's just she's like, that's the one part of the movie that's just not very good in my opinion, is that her performance. And another problem that I have with it is that I think this is a good time to talk about like weaker aspects of the film. Is that a lot of people don't like the ending, but that's like a Danny Boyle type of thing, where they just don't really like the ending.
So, do you mean the very ending?
Well, no, I'm talking about the last act.
You know, there's also like, the original ending with the blurry, with the freeze frame car thing. Yeah, you told me that was the original ending.
No, that wasn't the original ending. Like, it ends with the freeze frame, and then it's like them trying to save him after, but he dies, and then they like walk through an abandoned hospital, and it's kind of like, what the? Yeah. But that ending sort of kind of works for the point of like Jim trying to find a father figure throughout the film, because like the second to last one was Christopher Eccleston. Like Christopher
Yes.
Eccleston tried to be his dad, and then Jim was like, "No, I don't want that." And so like that all happens, and then it would have made sense because each time the father figure died, it would have made sense for Jim to die thematically speaking, but I don't know. That would have been just too.
The actual very end, I think, was
Yeah,
really
the other ending is sort of more hopeful, which is kind of nice as well.
It is nice, you know.
Yeah, it's a nice after the horror.
Yeah,
that's
after
that ending.
after the whole
After
how dark that whole movie was, it's like, oh, hey,
yeah. After the eye gouging scene, it's like, okay, I need something a little happy.
There's something. The thing about that, which I think is really that's a cool parallel again to the rage virus, is that he was completely enraged and like animalistic when he was doing that, almost to the point of the zombies.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting.
Another thing that I liked about that as well was that sort of like the movie also kind of reflects the circle of life very well. Like you're sort of born, you grow up, you grow connections, and then like you die at the end. Sort of. I feel like that when he becomes like that zombie, he sort of dies at the end, and then he's reborn a new person.
Yeah, yeah.
So that's sort of where, and again, that also works with the religious symbolism of rebirth and baptism and like the rising of Christ and stuff like that. But it's not. It's less Man of Steel. And
that's another day. That's still another day.
And that's actually a good time. That's one of the only films that I can really think that religious symbolism was done very well and not beat you over the head with it. Because like, who knows what Laokin and his sons are, other than nerds like me that just like look it up online. But I think it's done very well, and I think we're getting to the point where we should say our final thoughts on the film. So Adam. What are your final take? Just take time to talk about things that you like, what you didn't like, and any last thoughts.
So overall, I think you stated a lot of what I do like in the film. It's a very coherent story with strong characters and definitely sort of that underlying social commentary that isn't too overt, in my opinion, unlike Zootopia.
In the beginning, it was predators and prey.
yeah, that type of stuff. And then throughout the rest of the film, I think everything just sort of reinforced its whole dream-like status. Like it's sort of a weird, euphoric sort of like feeling that I don't really get with a whole lot other films. As for the weaker aspects you mentioned, I do see how that girl actress was sort of the weaker aspect of it, but I don't think it distracted me too much while I was watching it. I didn't feel like, wow, this girl's bad acting is taking me out of the movie. I think I was able to follow it all right. In the ending, I mean, even though it does sort of make sense thematically, you know, sort of the rebirth and sort of the hopefulness towards the end, definitely sort of the freeze frame, you know, the quick sort of fast-paced montage of them trying to revive him, like, it just felt a little disorienting to me.
Yeah, and that was supposed to be the original ending, was that just like they try to revive him and then he dies, and it's like that would have been. Danny Boyle seems to struggle with endings at times. He can't seem to please people.
But aside from that, I was very impressed with this movie.
Brennan, any last thoughts or things that you want to say about the movie?
Yeah, it's become probably one of my favorite films. You know, something. It has everything. I mean, there's no perfect film, but this film just has so much going for it. I mean, the writing is excellent. The acting, for the most part, is very, very good. You know, the set design is interesting. His cinematography is brilliant. I think one of my favorite things is at to reflect like the chaos at the end of the military complex is the rain. Yeah. There's so many cool shots in the rain. The music's excellent, but I mean, just as a film, it's great. Yeah, and it's one of my favorite. It's probably one of my favorite horror films, and it's definitely like my top 10 favorite movies. And that's all we have for our show right now. But we'd like to thank you guys for watching, and we'll be back soon.